Welcome back, everyone, to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. Today is Monday, September 19th, 2022. Joe Biden finally, after quite a few months, decided to do a one-on-one interview last night with Scott Pelley on 60 Minutes, CBS's 60-minute show. He did a one-on-one interview. We got a couple of leaks out of it early to tease it. But the big stories that are coming out of this, I think, are things that I don't think the White House was prepared to leak and spin ahead of time. I mean, it's hard to know where to start with this interview. First off, Biden once again eliminated all strategic ambiguity around Taiwan, the strategic ambiguity that we've had in place for decades, which doesn't necessarily commit us to military action on behalf of Taiwan, but certainly leaves the possibility open. Last night, once again, it's not the first time he's done this. Biden made it clear that the United States would militarily respond if Taiwan was attacked, which is a line in the sand that is probably reality. But just the same has been the point of strategic ambiguity for a reason. And the reason is not to provoke China. China may not be as militarily adept as the United States. And in fact, I think we've overassessed our enemies, as we're seeing in Russia. And I'll have more on that in a second. But it's still significant. And a war with China would be extremely risky. China is, after all, a nuclear power. And they have satellites such as North Korea that are also nuclear powers. You've got Iran, which is a quasi-nuclear power, which would be part of that. Russia would probably join in. This is not the type of thing that you toss around without a great deal of consideration. And yet Joe Biden, once again, as Jazz puts it in his post this morning, decided to just simply commit the United States to war in that case. Not wise. And again, once again, an example of how Joe Biden is terrible at strategy. He's not even very good at tactics. He is playing checkers in a three-dimensional chess world. And this is just yet another example of Joe Biden being incompetent and completely unqualified for this job. In a constitutional qualification, because he's old enough and he's a United States citizen. It's the only formal qualifications you need, other than to get people to vote for you, which he also did. However, in terms of competence, this is someone who never should have been given an executive job in the first place. And we can thank Barack Obama for that mistake, that historic mistake with Joe Biden. He also then went on to declare that the COVID pandemic is over. Now, this is also more or less a statement of truth. However, his entire administration is going forward on the basis of an unending COVID pandemic emergency. They are fighting to reinstate the mask mandate on transit, on airplanes, on trains, on buses, because on the basis of a pandemic and their claimed authority to make those decisions in a pandemic emergency. So if the pandemic is over, this appeal of this Florida decision in April is moot. There's no pandemic, there's no emergency, therefore there's no emergency power. And then later, after I read Stephen Miller, his tweet from last night, it occurred to me that it also undermines another key policy that just got rolled out a month ago, which is Joe Biden's student loan debt forgiveness plan, which is based on the idea that we're still in a pandemic emergency. Don't forget that the Department of Justice and the Department of Education both are relying on their interpretation of the HEROES Act and Congress's granting of authority to the executive in a pandemic emergency, in this specific pandemic emergency, in fact, the power to deal with student loan debt. Now, there's a lot of legal problems with this argument already. I've written about this before. First off, the HEROES Act only authorized the Treasury, the executive branch, to make monthly payments on the debt while the pandemic was creating economic upheaval, and they allocated a specific amount of funds for that, $45 billion. And that's it. That's the only appropriation that has been made. And this is going to cost $1 trillion. So the HEROES Act really wasn't going to, I doubt very seriously that would have withstood legal scrutiny in court as long as you could get somebody with standing to sue over this. But now Biden's declaring that the pandemic is over undercuts the entire grant of authority in the HEROES Act. It means that the HEROES Act is moot. If there's no pandemic, there's no emergency. If there's no emergency, the HEROES Act doesn't apply. And so there's no basis now on which Biden can pursue his bailout of academia. And I mean, this is a guy who just simply isn't thinking things through. And you have to wonder whether or not he's even been the guy making these arguments in the first place. Because if you're the guy making these arguments, if you're the guy who's developing these arguments, you would think that you would say, well, look, I can't ever say that the pandemic is over, because otherwise my arguments on the CDC authority to impose mandates and my academia bailout suddenly becomes moot. Clearly, that's not the thought process that's going on at the within Joe Biden's head anyway. And so you've got this sort of intellectual, I don't know what you'd call it, fog that's going on here. And because Joe Biden is off the cuff and he's just making it up as he's going along. And that's been true of his entire presidency. And then on top of that, and this is the subject of, Dwayne Patterson's VIP column today, you've got Joe Biden saying that inflation's really only going up an inch. I mean, this is nonsense. And what's more, it's obvious. It's an obvious lie. He's arguing that inflation isn't really that significant. And it's an obvious lie. And it's obvious to Americans who have to deal with the fact that they've lost ground on wages for 5 straight quarters and about to be 6 straight quarters because they're still losing ground on wages every single month when these PPI and CPI numbers come out. And wages simply haven't kept up. And nor will they at this rate of inflation. Employers just simply don't have the money to keep up with an inflation rate of 8.3% year on year. And so workers are going to lose money every single month. They have been for the last 15, 16 months, and it's going to continue to happen. So when you have a president that gets up on television and says, well, it's really not that big of an issue. It's really not that big of an issue. When people are paying an average of $460 more a month to buy the exact same stuff they bought 15 months ago, well, that's a problem. A lot of American households don't have an extra $460 a month on average to pay for groceries and gasoline and clothing and shelter, especially shelter. Rents are skyrocketing. Mortgage rates now are having to go up because the Fed is the only entity that's trying to actually deal with inflation. And so, I mean, this is just one nonsensical statement after another from Joe Biden. And we're going to have more on this. Karen's got a part of this. Joe Biden wasn't clear as to whether or not he was going to run for re-election. That's another issue because the White House has been insisting, well, he's running for re-election. He will run for re-election. Of course, we're not going to say anything officially, but all signals are that we're going to run for re-election. You got Joe Biden saying, well, I don't know if I'm going to run for re-election or not. Is it a firm decision that I run again? That remains to be seen, he said. And Politico notes that this is a lot less definitive than his declaration on the pandemic. Now, it's interesting, I think, that Joe Biden has abandoned strategic ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan, but he's embracing strategic ambiguity when it comes to his relationship with the Federal Election Commission. Because if Biden gets out and says, I am launching my re-election campaign today, of course, all sorts of rules then apply in terms of fundraising, in terms of spending, that sort of thing. The in-kind donation questions come into play, that sort of thing. So clearly, I mean, and it's smart not to get ahead of yourself, not to announce too early, especially if you're the incumbent president. It's probably a wise idea, under normal circumstances at least, to hold off on that so you don't have to deal with those issues. And I mean, honestly, if he was an incumbent president that was performing at least competently, you'd probably put it off for another year from now, right? Maybe September, October is when you launch your reelection campaign, because your own party isn't going to try to push you out of power. He's probably going to be forced to do this sometime in February or March, just to try to preclude people from getting too much momentum in pushing him out of the Democratic nomination, if he's going to do it at all. And so, I mean, he's all about strategic ambiguity when it comes to Joe Biden's interests. But when it comes to the interests of the United States, or for that matter, Taiwan, strategic ambiguity, throw it out the window. It's absolutely nuts. And it's absolutely selfish. It's absolutely self-centered. And, there's been lots of rhetoric about Donald Trump being a narcissist. You could make an argument that you have to almost be a narcissist in order to run for president in the first place. But, Barack Obama, we made that argument for Barack Obama. There was the argument with the Clintons, both of the Clintons, about being narcissists. And I think all of those have pretty good bases in fact. Donald Trump's as well. But Joe Biden is at least as big a narcissist as Donald Trump is. He just expresses it in different ways. And this is an example of this. It's all about Joe Biden. It's nothing else than Joe Biden. He's walking through the auto show without a mask. We say, oh, yeah, okay, the pandemic's over. Without thinking at all about what the implications of that statement actually are and how it undermines a number of his own initiatives. He wanted to look good in the moment. And interestingly, this was actually Red Steez's point. Scott Pelley never follows up on that. Scott Pelley apparently isn't even read into these issues well enough to do a follow-up question on that, such as, well, if the pandemic's over, why are we doing the student loan bailout? If the pandemic's over, why are you challenging that ruling in Florida? Because it's moot. If the pandemic's over, the CDC's authority ends. Scott Pelley never bothers to ask a follow-up question. That was actually Red Steez's point, and it's a great one, but I think that the larger point here is that now there's a whole host of administration initiatives that should be canceled as a result of that, and the student loan bailout is certainly one of those. All right, on to some of the other stories. I've been following the developments in Ukraine and Russia for, just as long as, for the whole war. And I've been putting a lot of them up in the headlines. I try to only do maybe one post a day on this, fleshing out some of the more important details. And one of the more important details today is the fact that Russia at least sent at least 2 separate attacks on around Ukraine's second largest nuclear power plant. And that was today. And this is not the plant in Zaporizhia, which is the largest one that they have. In fact, it's the largest one on the European continent. This is and I'm going to screw up this name, so please bear with me. Yuzhnokransk. Yuzhnokransk, I believe, is the name of the town that this is nearby, and it had 2 separate missile attacks in the last 24 hours. And this is as Russia's lines are collapsing in the east, and that they're trying to prevent a collapse in the southwest around Kherson, which is it's a vital link between Russian forces and Crimea, and especially now that Russia can't relieve Crimea by sea, at least not easily, because the Ukrainians have proven rather adept at sinking Russian ships in the Black Sea or Sea of Azov, either one. And so they have to have a land bridge, and Kherson is the link. If they lose Kherson, if they have to retreat from Kherson, the Crimean Peninsula is going to be cut off. That doesn't mean that they can't defend themselves, but it does mean that they're cut off and they can't be relieved. And that is going to be a really bad position for Russian forces in Crimea. So this is a very interesting development, and I've been really keeping up with this at the Institute for the Study of War, which is understandingwar.org. They have been doing a marvelous job of keeping an eye on all of the different aspects of the warfare that's going on in Ukraine, including what's going on in Russia. And what's going on in Russia is they're talking about grinding up Ukraine in order to own the NATO's. Basically, is what they're talking about. There's a Duma deputy named Gurylyov who was on Russian TV yesterday, or maybe overnight, talking about how they're going to turn the UK into a Martian desert if NATO retaliates for nuclear weapons use in Ukraine. I mean, this is pretty bad stuff. And Gurylyov is a Putin ally. So this is the type of thing that they're feeding into the Russian people. However, there's so much carnage going on among Russian forces that that I think that this message is not going to be particularly resonant. In fact, one of the things that Gurylyov says is that the Ukrainian forces are 50% mercenaries from NATO, which is absurd. It's absurd. It's an absurd claim, but it's sort of a case of projection because Putin is trying to build an entire new army corps apparently out of irregular forces. They're recruiting criminals, they're recruiting people from, who are older people, retired people, people with very little training, who are not going to perform well under combat conditions. And they've already seen that with some of the conscript units that they've tried to send in there to rescue the positions in the southeast and the southwest of Ukraine. So there's a lot going on in this. And I think one of the two things about this, and I'll just say this. One is I think it's a very dangerous moment for the Ukrainians right now because Russia is about to get very, very desperate. Putin's about to get very, very desperate about the fact that they have lost the initiative, they've lost the momentum, they don't have the any way to replace what they've lost. They're leaving behind tons of materiel that they can't recover and they can't replace, and that makes them dangerous, which is the reason why they may be resorting to what Zelensky called nuclear terrorism. And the other thing that I think we need to be, cognizant of is that this is still going to go on for a long time. Now, we talked about, for months, we've talked about the fact that Russian resources would probably get exhausted by September, sometime in September, maybe early October. And if they didn't win by that time, they would have to negotiate an end. And we're reaching that time. And this is, again, a dangerous place. Zelensky doesn't want to negotiate at this point. He wants to have this out on the battlefield because he wants to make sure that the Russian military is so damaged that they can't come back and do this again. And I think that the other thing is he wants to recover all of Ukraine, all of the Ukraine territory that was recognized as sovereign Ukraine territory in 1991. He wants to recover every single last inch of this, and you can understand why. They put up with the Russian semi-seizure of the Donbass and the Russian annexation of Crimea. They never acknowledged it, but they put up with it in order to avoid war. Well, now that war is here, Zelensky wants it settled once and for all. And that's understandable. It could be dangerous. And that's the reason why we need to be, a little cautious about what we're cheering on, what we're not cheering on. Certainly in terms of justice, that makes sense. But given the risks involved, I think what we're hoping for is a negotiated end to this that somehow creates a just outcome, and hopefully one that completely discredits Putinism inside Russia for a very long time to come. That may take a while, and we should be cognizant that this war is not going to end today, tomorrow, or next week, even though we really like it to. And if it does, that's great. This is going to drag on for quite a while longer. And it's going to get uglier and uglier as it does. And I think that this thing probably doesn't end without Vladimir Putin falling victim to the Moscow window flu in one way or another, if you know what I mean. All right, lots of other stuff coming up today at Hot Air. Lots of other stuff is already up, in fact. Jez got a great post about D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser saying, well, you can't send the migrants here. We're not a border town. We're not Texas. Which Texas, I think, being a Texan myself now, I can say, well, screw you. We've been doing it for a very long time. It's your turn now to deal with these situations. And I think that there was a great post yesterday, and I believe it was from Beej Wellborn, who's been doing a great job here, that something about Fetterman's polling is scaring the bejeebus out of his campaign. That went up yesterday, still getting a lot of traffic today. It's great. David Strom is insane. I'm just going to say that right now. I hired David Strom. He's completely insane. He's doing a great job. He's got a really good post about this school teacher in Ontario, Canada, who's showing up with these humongous fake breasts. He's a shop teacher who's identifying as trans, and he's got these humongous, enormous fake breasts. And the school is defending this. It's a high school. And as he says, it's a pathetic parody of women, and it's a great post. You got to check this out. There is a post up about a Taliban fighter being freed from Gitmo in a prisoner exchange. That's sort of a fluid situation. So we'll keep an eye on that. And much more to come. We got lots of stuff to come. So be sure to check out, Karen Townsend's not even up yet. Her first post is coming up. We just have so much content right now that it's tough for me. I'm managing editor. I've got an embarrassment of riches now at my fingertips at Hot Air, as do you. We've got tons of content. We're hoping that you're enjoying it. And by the way, later today, maybe before this or maybe after this podcast goes up, we'll have the second half of our conversation with Adam Baldwin and the Amiable Skeptics. This is about authoritarianism, the constitutional response to it, and why Article 5 matters. And I think you're going to find this to be a fascinating conversation. I think you're really going to enjoy it. And certainly I enjoy every time I get a chance to sit down with Adam. He's a smart guy, and I am really enjoying his foray now into his renewed foray into politics. And I think you will as well as VIP members. So be sure to sign up for VIP. There's a short message at the end of this. And tomorrow I'll be back with Andrew Malcolm. I've got Selena Zito, I think, coming up for Wednesday's podcast. Dwayne's back on Thursday. We're going to talk to Harry Crocker on Friday about his new Western novel from Regnery, Harry Crocker from Regnery, who's got a new Western novel and how that feeds into conservative values. Lots of great discussions coming up this week, so be sure to not miss a minute of the Ed Morrissey Show podcast and find out how you can subscribe to my feeds, as well as our VIP and VIP Gold programs. Our VIP Gold conversation with Cam Edwards takes place on Wednesday, so don't miss that as well. Thank you for listening, and come back. Thank you for watching or listening to the Ed Morrissey Show podcast. You can subscribe to us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and through the Town Hall Media Player, or you can just come to hotair.com and watch my podcast for free. However, I'd also love to have you join us as members of our VIP and VIP Gold programs. That allows us to defeat the stranglehold that big tech has on information and get you the best information that we possibly can. Plus, we have a lot of new value-added content coming to us from Town Hall Media stars and my good friend Adam Baldwin. He and I are doing the video series, The Amiable Skeptics. It's 1 hour of discussion a week, strictly for our VIP and VIP Gold members. Plus, we have our VIP Gold chat with Cam Edwards every Wednesday afternoon at 1:30 p.m. We'd love to have you as members. Be sure to join up. Thanks again for watching the Ed Morrissey Show podcast.